Hey everyone, welcome to the VLL podcast. I'm Dr. Christie,
I am Dr. Kimmy.
and we're just a couple of doctors of education who love to get together to talk about all things learning and development.
We really do. And today in episode 2, we are going to talk about why more training is usually the wrong answer. That's right. More does not equal better. So to start, let's talk about maybe why people assume or make this assumption that more equals better. And I feel like that's kind of a knee-jerk reaction, right? You're pressed for time. The most common response when there's a performance issue is just more training. More training equals better employees. Yeah, sales are down, customer complaints are up. Let's just roll out more training. And what do you think is the main issue about that, Christy?
I think that in the shortest answer I have to that is that training has become the organizational equivalent of try turning it off and then back on again. It just feels like it's a Band-Aid. I think because it's perceived as a quick and dirty and easy solution.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's this misconception of like, just throw some training at the problem and make it go away. And, and then that's almost like the philosophy of the business and of the L&D department sometimes, depending on the experience of who's running it. And I think, this often comes from this, and I've talked about this in previous podcasts, in the K through 12 and even in the academic, university, higher education environment, we are held responsible as institutions and as educators for demonstrating that we have developed these minds, right? I mean, people have to take these exams. They have to, you see universities that brag about how many of their graduates go on to get full-time jobs. There are metrics that really make or break these institutions. You don't get funding as a public school if your children aren't able to pass, standardized exams. And so there's a lot of high stakes and a lot of pressure, right? And so then, we have to put a lot of intentional design, and we have to put a lot of thought into how we deliver training, how we're assessing it, and how we are moving people along the journey of knowledge and skill acquisition. But then when you get into professional space, i.e. work, that I don't want to say care, but I guess that accountability, it's gone, right? So it's now sort of like, oh, you want to level up, you want to learn more, you want to know more, you want to get a raise, well, figure out how to do it. It's on you, right? And so sometimes, this might be controversial, but it's my podcast, I can say it.
Tell me.
I feel like L&D programs and companies are there for sometimes like smoke and mirrors, right? They're an extension of HR. They're there to sort of give the guys and give the impression that we are here to help you onboard more quickly, more successfully, so that you can, so that your ramp up time is decreased, and so that you can effectively start making the company money sooner. But the thought process and the type of design and the type of expertise that is, required to do that at scale and in a way that we can actually demonstrate it's working, that level of expertise, when you suggest it, is often downplayed as overthinking. That's too much. We don't need learning outcomes. How many times have we heard that?
Oh, gosh.
We don't, a storyboard like SME input. Oy vey, you're just really overthinking it, aren't you? But in a K through 12 or a higher ed environment, usually, we won't say always, but usually that type of rigorous methodology is welcomed and expected. Again, because we do have to demonstrate outcomes in that environment. And so I said all that to say, I think that this knee-jerk reaction it comes from this perspective of, which I think just kind of falls back on natural sort of like adult psychology, which is like, well, I made a training and I administered a training. And so my part is done. If they didn't get the training and they didn't level up after that, it's on them, because at the end of the day, we're all adults and this isn't actually school. This is work. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right,
and
right,
so
right.
Yeah.
And they're saying, look, we did something. We did something to fix the problem, but
Mm,
they didn't diagnose what the problem is, maybe. And so I think we talked about this last time a little bit. It's like just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and
mhm.
hoping something sticks. You could kind of liken it to that in some ways. And I
Exactly.
think, as you mentioned K through 12, one thing that it made me think of as well is like testing. If you have to do more testing, then you have to do more training for tests. And then this whole stereotype of teaching for the test emerged because it's just, they were thinking about the problem as just this knowledge gap instead of actually teaching students how to critically think and learn so that instead of just teaching for the test. And you can
Mm.
kind of liken it to that. It's like you assume there's a problem, just figure out how to get to the fastest, cheapest way to fix it and just do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that actually brings us to another point that, we were going to talk about after this, which is like why more training just feels right. And you really made such a nice segue, and it's truly because it feels proactive. It feels
Mhm.
productive. Right. And, leaders assume the problem is equated to a knowledge gap, kind of like I mentioned before, like I gave K through 12 in academia as an example. That's not to say that they're doing it the right way either.
Right.
You and I both have taken a critical approach throughout our research and, all of our graduate studies and the pursuit of our doctorates. We've both taken a critical approach in our dissertations and in everything that we do. And so there would be no need for a critical approach if everyone was doing it well. But I do think that L&D is positioned as a solution to everything, while also sometimes at the same time being a solution to nothing. And I think often because, like you said, there's no diagnosis and they're not really allowed to evaluate what's really happening. And so they're basing their solutions on assumptions. And I think truly around this
Yes.
idea of like what happens a lot in corporate world, which is like we've taken the problem and we've moved it to a different part of the chessboard. And so now it's somebody else's problem to deal with. And that's what happens
Right.
when you create a training that is not based on a diagnostic, that is just based on assumptions. You create this training that's very shiny, has lots of interactivity. It's made with like really cool authoring tools. It
Mhm.
looks amazing. It's been approved by leadership, quote unquote. So it launches, it goes live. The minute that training goes live, the problem has now been moved off of L&D's desk onto someone else's desk. And that desk is usually like the managers or the supervisors of the teams who are responsible for completing the training. So now
Mhm.
it's your problem to deal with.
Right.
And if performance doesn't improve as a result of that, it's not because of me, because I did what I was supposed to do. You know what
Right.
I mean? Yeah.
Unless you're using training just as a Band-Aid and then they do something else to put it so then you just have like a stack of Band-Aids and really no actual problem
Mm,
being solved. You still have that initial issue to
I've
deal
been waiting
with.
my whole life to say this in a public forum. Yeah,
Let's
a
hear it.
stack of Band-Aids, it's just like turtles all the way down. You know what I mean? You look out your window and it's just turtles all the way down. I don't remember what that's from, but
Well, I'm glad that I was able to set you up for that.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
So, what are some examples of maybe some other things or aspects causing this misdiagnosis? Like, what could the problem be? I remember we were talking recently about how it could be a cultural issue. For instance, someone doesn't know how to ask for the help for the training or that they can have access to training, for instance. So that could be a workplace culture or culture kind of difference.
Mhm.
But what other kinds of rationale or reasoning would there be for some of these misdiagnoses?
So from my experience, from our experience, what we see a lot is that most training is, built without understanding the actual problem. And when we are given the opportunity to actually go in and diagnose the problem time and time again, what we find out is that it's labeled a performance issue, but it's actually more of a process friction. So the system, isn't designed. So the answer to my question lives 4 clicks deep in a system that I forgot my password to, right? I mean,
Mhm.
just something as
Yeah.
simple as that. It's just system friction, process friction. Or
Right.
I've been in situations where we were directing customer service representatives to refer to PDFs, answers to questions that were out of date and that were referencing SOPs that were no longer relevant, right? It's just that, and they
Okay.
didn't have a
Yeah.
workflow in place. It's like nobody had been monitoring that. Like it had just been a while since someone took a look at those SOPs and realized that, oh, they're out of date. Those types of like process system friction.
Didn't we also have a client? It might be the same one I think you're referring to, where they just notified people through one email that was sent out one time during onboarding, and then there
Mhm.
was no follow up. There was no anything. So that could have easily just slipped through the cracks,
Mhm.
as happens with email these days. Once you get, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, so the learners didn't know the training existed, but they were
yeah,
being held accountable for completing
hmm
it, right? So that's a misalignment between the process, the system, and the workflow.
hmm
I think a lack of clarity rather than a lack of knowledge is sometimes that's also something that we see a lot. And so, like for example, a big client that we just wrapped up, when we conducted the discovery analysis with them, like their initial hypothesis was that a lot of people they needed help. They needed help with their content. That people weren't engaging with their content. They had a lot of content with no clicks or clicks, and then people would drop off after a few seconds. And they just were very concerned that it was a content issue. And when we conducted our discovery, we found out that the issue was that people just weren't sure how to use it. There was a collection of resources, many of them videos, some of them PDFs, and you would get into the resource and you would land on the PDF, but there wasn't any like learner experience design introducing that asset, explaining how you're supposed to use it, what you're supposed to take away from it, and then giving some sort of exit ticket, right? So like now, and now that you've used it, here's something, that you can take with you into the field to apply it in an authentic way. And so, when we went back in and redesigned their system, we didn't change the
hmm
actual training tool. All that we did was we built scaffolding around it
yes,
in the form of like a pre, during, post. Like, welcome to this training asset. Here are 3 things you're supposed to take away. Here's what others have found when they've used it. After you've used it, you should be able to do XYZ, right? Just adding that scaffolding on either side of the asset drastically improved the clarity for the user to understand how to actually apply it. And so it was a clarity issue rather than a knowledge issue.
right.
And yeah. So, I think it often comes down to the fact that you don't solve a diagnosis problem with a content solution. And so a lot of people, again, they just want to come back to, we need to improve the content. The content's not falling flat. It's not gamified enough. There's not enough emojis, or it's too
hmm
long, make it shorter. But that's often not, what we see.
So then let's talk more about then what happens when you default to just more training. What are kind of the ripple effects? What happens when you're misdiagnosing these problems and just giving more trainings? I mean, I could think of some off the top of my head, like, you lose the confidence of your workers because they just think, oh, they're throwing another training at us. You might even become kind of like an inside joke with employees. I've definitely experienced that, where we've had all team meetings and then we know that we can just make fun of the tech issues for the first 15 minutes of the call, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
what are some other more business related issues, I think, or realities that could come as ripple or downstream effects from not not focusing on finding solutions to the right problem, or giving our stack of band-aids instead?
But so some of the things I've encountered, and I talk about this a lot, your L&D program becomes reactive instead of proactive. So instead of
hmm
embedding your L&D program across the multiple departments and, having regular engagements with the C-suite, talking to managers often, of multiple teams, where they're proactively collecting data, Slack is a great place. For example, Teams, like L&D programs should be should be collecting proactive data that they can anticipate training problems before they become a problem. But that's a conversation for another day. So when you're not doing that and you are a reactive content creation department, then you become an order taker essentially. So you just sit and you wait for the training to come down the pipeline. Somebody fills out a form, they request a training, you make it, right? The other problem that we see is that, like a recent client that I had, which is they had a very full LMS, over 200 learning and training assets in the LMS, but they had very low engagement with it. And so,
Hmm.
again, it was assumed that the content itself, well, the content itself just must be terrible. That's why people aren't engaging with it. And it was like, no, they either A, can't find it, or B, once they find it, they don't know what to do with it.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the other biggest issue, which people complain about a lot, but they're not understanding how they're connected, which is wasted development time.
Yeah.
So when you're an order taker and you're just taking the orders that come down the line and you're solving for problems that don't exist, you're spending very valuable development time to create learning products that you don't actually need.
Hmm.
And instead, you could be rerouting that time, right? To have folks like the example I gave earlier be more embedded throughout the company so that they're collecting proactive data that then leads to solving real problems. And the savings that you get from that, comes out on the other side of people. Like I said, people are spending less development time creating solutions for problems we don't have. But then think about the money saved on the other side when we actually do solve the right problems. When onboarding, instead of taking, we'll say there's onboarding and then there's ramp up time.
Hmm.
And those are two very different things. There's, okay, onboarding should take 30 days. Okay, it takes 30 days for me to fill out the paperwork, to get logged into the things, to get my computer, and to navigate the mailroom. So there's sort of like that overt onboarding on paper. But then it's like, how long does it actually take a new hire to ramp up and to start operating at a productive level? And especially if you're in sales, for example, how long does it take them to actually start making money? Those are two very different things. Right.
Hmm.
And just because the onboarding ended at 30 days, their ramp up time, might be taking 6 months. And you really need to be closing that gap. And so think about the time wasted there. And what if we were able to investigate why it's taking ramp up time so long and we were able to solve that problem? That's astronomical. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems that companies have that they need to solve for, ramp up time. And then when we're thinking about the customer, when we're thinking about customer churn, for example, so customers don't know how to use your product
Hmm.
because your training, or that maybe you didn't provide any training at all. That's a thing. Or the training that you provided didn't help them learn how to use your product well, so they didn't renew, right? It was too confusing. And so you lost a customer. So what if we were able to eliminate that problem? Learner fatigue,
Hmm.
another training, right? And I think also as a customer too, I think like IKEA, is a really great example. The instructions that IKEA provides, it's the reason I don't shop at IKEA because I can't follow those instructions. The reason I don't shop at IKEA is because the instructions just make me want to cry. One time, I tried to put a couch together, Kimmy, that I got from IKEA. This is when I first moved back from Korea and I was sitting on the floor. I put the seat of the couch on upside down. And no, it wasn't obvious to me that it was upside down, but that's again a conversation for another day. But I was losing my mind. I had to call my grandpa over. I was like, but I followed the instructions. Anyway, we figured out it was upside down. Long story short, now fortunately, I can buy couches that are already put together. But I would say that the lack of support in effectively using IKEA products as a consumer is the number one impediment for me personally. And I'm sure I'm not the only one out there.
It's
And then
interesting because I'm the opposite actually, but I'm thinking I love building furniture and I have a lot of IKEA furniture, but I I'm not particularly it's not a strength of mine, but I like puzzles. And I think for
Mm,
me, it's being stubborn and being wanting to finish my puzzle that puts me through it. However, we don't if we liken it to training, that's like the worst possible thing to do with your learners and your staff and
yeah,
whoever is taking whatever
absolutely.
training or course that you're building. It's you want to make those stakes as low as possible so then they can put all of that working memory, all of that energy into actually learning the content and not how to use the system. So,
Yeah.
and
No,
we talked a lot about
yeah,
that last time.
But my cognitive load is expired just figuring out the instructions. I haven't even
Mhm.
taken it out of the box yet. I haven't even started to put together your product.
Okay.
So yeah, if I'm exhausted just looking at your instructions, then
For
obviously
sure.
this isn't working for me. And you made a really good point. I hate puzzles. I'm not a puzzle person. You will never catch me doing a puzzle. The final thing is no measurable business impact. And so when you default to training constantly and training that isn't solving the right problem, then you end up with an L&D program or a stack of training that you have no measurable ROI on.
Mhm.
And you have no one to blame but yourself.
You have a shiny car and no one to drive it.
That's right. Yeah, or no one that knows how to drive it.
We talked about the actual cost, right, of having more training, overwhelming training, a fancy system or fancy car, like we said, but no one to drive it. What are other kind of more hidden costs of more training? Would you think beyond money and time? What other places or in what other ways are you going to feel that pinch? I think.
I think you nailed it. The erosion of trust.
Hmm.
But I think the erosion of trust from your employees on the company, the erosion of trust from the customer of your product. Think about me. I don't trust IKEA. I go in for the
Yeah.
meatballs. I get out of there. Increased cognitive load for your learners, like I
Hmm.
mentioned. I'm exhausted just looking at your instructions. Then I'm done. If I'm exhausted just trying to get into your LMS, I'm done. And so, but then I think from a company perspective, and we see this a lot, this is every year when they have the ATD conference, this is the number one takeaway that people get from it, which is the erosion of trust in L&D as a professional program or, part of your company is that people
Hmm.
think, anytime companies need to downsize, L&D is the first one to go because they're like, we don't really need them anyway.
Right. And then you think about the actual cost associated with some of those things as well. Your learners are maxed out on cognitive load, then it's going to take them 2, 3 times as long to finish the training. And you're paying those hours and you're paying those hours per person times however many employees you have. And that just
Mhm.
kind of exacerbates and piles. I guess I'm talking about piles a lot today. I don't know why.
What other piles? The turtles?
The Band-Aids and
The
turtles, yeah,
Band-Aids, the
and now we
turtles?
have piles of maybe I just wanted to show off my Pittsburgh accent and say piles. What do we think L&D folks should do instead? Instead of this knee-jerk reaction, more training or complete reset. Where do you recommend people listening to this start?
So I think you need to start first and foremost with a very clear, validated skill and knowledge gap. So what we said earlier when we said a lot of times people think that the issue is related to a knowledge gap, and we sort of poo-pooed it a little bit, to use your words. But that is very true. It is true. It is typically related to a skill and knowledge gap. I mean, that is just how the field of education works. You have the zone of proximal development, who's developed by our boy Vygotsky, Lev Vygotsky, in fact. And, it's this whole idea that you have some knowledge at a certain level, but you
Mhm.
need that knowledge to be at a different level, right? And so there's a gap between those two, and you need to grow and develop. And you do that by gaining knowledge and skills, by acquiring knowledge and skills. And so that's a very fundamental principle in education.
Right.
So we're not
He says we do it by working with people who are more knowledgeable than us. Yes.
exactly the more knowledgeable others. That's the fundamental concept, right, in learning and development. But the problem is that we are guessing what the knowledge and skill gap is. Right. And the people that are guessing what the knowledge and skill gap is usually don't even have a background in education, and they don't understand how to evaluate people to determine what that knowledge and skill gap is. They're not using any validated tools. They're not referencing frameworks or research. Corn Ferry has a really good one. It's already been validated multiple times. We've validated it with our own clients. Corn Ferry has, again, as a huge international company, they've spent millions validating this framework. And so I think that's a great place to start. Then you want to make sure that all of your training is tied back to a defined competency. So again, if financial acumen is the skill that we are training for or the competency that we're training for, how are we defining it? So it
Mhm.
needs to be well
What does that
defined.
look
What does it
like?
look like? If I'm observing you demonstrating this skill, what behaviors and what tasks will I see you perform that will demonstrate novice versus intermediate versus proficiency? And so these things
Mhm.
all need to be well defined. And if they're not well defined from an organizational standpoint, then again, you end up with a lot of guessing, a lot of anecdotes, a lot of, the previous manager wanted it done like this. My current manager wants it done this way. And so it ends up just being a very subjective experience. And it's really difficult to build training for subjective targets, I think is probably the big takeaway there. But when it is very well defined and objective, then you can work backwards and build training for that.
Mhm.
Obviously connected to a business outcome. So if somebody is requesting training when we know training is the right answer, it comes down to what business outcome is this trying to achieve? So I mentioned onboarding before, right? Like getting employees ramped up currently it's taking 3 months and it's costing the company X. If we could reduce that to
Mhm.
30 days, then we save money, right? And so that's a very clear business outcome. And we can work backwards from there to develop training that solves that problem. And then really big thing that I think people miss is that it needs to fit into a broader system. So
Yes.
anytime you're thinking about training, you need to look at your validated knowledge, skill, competency framework. You need to understand what knowledge and skills it is serving, what competency it's serving, what business outcome it's serving, what departments it's serving, what other quarterly goals you might have it serving. Is it up against any other big trainings that are coming down the pipeline that are going to interact with this and force people to come off of the sales floor or come off of the customer service floor to be able to complete this training, which is going to cause people to feel less psychologically safe to complete this training? You have to zoom out. You really do have to
Mhm.
zoom out and think about L&D and training as part of a larger ecosystem. And you really want to take a look at where it fits. So using the chessboard as another example, again, like where does it fit on this broader board? And if it doesn't fit, then you probably don't need it, right? And then
Just talking to people, and that gets you data, and with the data you can have a data informed system, which is going to be your secret weapon, honestly.
yes,
It's no sense
yeah.
having this wonderful system that is either not relevant to people's experience or doesn't fit in with how they operate or so on and so forth. Yeah. So I just
Or
wanted
just
to
sitting on
highlight
top
that.
of a pile of turtles.
Exactly. Hmm.
It's not.
So to not have the turtle pile, what do
Mhm.
we recommend? What does good look like? Let's put it all together.
Well,
So we have a
the
good
data, of
system, we have
course,
good data. How does this make us or make organizations behave differently?
bringing it all together. These are all things we've already mentioned. Start with the data, not requests.
Mhm.
Diagnose before building anything.
Mhm.
Push back on vague requests. Ask people to give you very specific business goals that it's tied to. Ask them to tell you how they know this problem exists. Do they have any data to tell you that the reason why it's taking new hires 90 days to ramp up on the sales process is because of X problem? And align with business metrics. Aligning with business metrics really has to start with having a member of the L&D team. So whether that's the manager or the director or whoever is the leader of the L&D team needs to have a seat at the C-suite table where they have eyes and ears on what the business problems are so that they
Mhm.
can collaborate with them and take it back to the L&D team and say, here's the problems that we already have training for, or we need to create new training to solve.
Mhm. It's being strategic, intentional, and using what you have to make smart decisions instead of knee-jerk reactions. And once
No
we
more
have all of
spaghetti
that, more
on the wall.
spaghetti?
No more spaghetti on the wall.
No more spaghetti on the wall. Exactly. We want spaghetti that we can eat, I guess. Miss Spaghetti on the plate. So let's say we're following our advice. What happens then? What outcomes are there, for instance? Off the top of my head, I can think probably if you're not using more trainings as the answer, fewer trainings is a obvious benefit. And I think those trainings will, depending on how long the people are employed at your organization, that they could be very pleased about that. I can say for as I
Mm.
was adjuncting once at 3 different universities, and I had to take 3 separate sexual harassment training modules on Thanksgiving weekend one year. And I was like, "Why who can I talk to so that I can get, like, a pass?" You know what I mean? Like, why do I have to do 3 separate trainings on the same topic? I just didn't feel like anyone was listening to me. You know what I mean? So, I feel like the opposite
Mhm.
would if you're more intentional.
Yeah. Well, we said this in the very beginning of the podcast, quality over quantity.
Mhm,
And I think that really has to be the goal. Fewer training programs, and the training programs that you do have focus on higher impact. So quality
mhm.
over quantity, having a clear link between training and performance.
Yeah, that's
So
big.
this ties back to accountability. Like we talked about how
Mhm,
there's a lot of accountability when you're doing school or when you're in these more formal educational spaces. But just because we're not in a college classroom doesn't mean that we don't have to track performance. And there are ways to track performance, and there are definitely ways to demonstrate that your training is having an impact beyond just did they complete the, the e-learning course. It's
mhm.
often something you and we take for granted as being sort of like a no duh situation. But I recently had a client ask me this question. So we have the LMS is the only way that we're delivering. It's a customer focus. So they sell training, and it's self-paced e-learning. So people come into, they purchase monthly access, they come into the system, they access the e-learning. And, they said like, well, how do we measure that they actually acquired the knowledge and skills that we intended for them to acquire outside of just they completed the course? And I said, well, if you build assessments into the course that they have to pass at let's say an 80, so they have to get 8 out of 10 questions right. Otherwise, they won't be able to complete the course. Then you can say with some level of certainty that they have acquired the intended knowledge and skills. Now, of course, this ties into assessment design. Was the assessment designed with the learning outcomes in mind, right? And so we do get into this, the murky waters of like, show me those questions,
Right. But
Did you enjoy this course? Yes or no?
yeah. But how would you know that if you don't have any sort of objective for your course? Why the intentionality is so important. It all kind of feeds back into each other and into this
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. So we talked about what that process looks like. We talked about an instructional design process where you're working with a subject matter expert and you're working with an instructional designer, and you need to build, if you have a well-designed course that starts with the end in mind, that starts with here are the intended learning outcomes. So at the beginning of taking this course, you may not know these things. But at the end of this course, we can guarantee that you will know these things. And in fact, we are going to provide an assessment that demonstrates that you know these things. If you want to be really intentional about it, do a pre-test, post-test. They take the test prior to the e-learning, and then they take the same test at the end of the e-learning. And if there is a measurable increase in their score, then you
Mhm,
can say with statistical certainty that they have acquired the knowledge and skills that you've intended them to acquire, right? And despite the fact that the people in this organization, they have been quote unquote working in L&D for decades, this concept had never occurred to them, right? And I think that's just a reminder of like why you need people who work in your L&D department to have a background in education. I'm not talking about a background as a facilitator, like I'm a subject matter expert and I have transitioned into facilitating or teaching these things, but somebody who comes from training, education, a degree, classroom experience,
mhm,
that's why it's so important, because those types of concepts are normal for us. It's common,
mhm.
they're not mind blowing. We've been doing them for years.
Yeah.
And so that boils down to training becoming intentional rather than reactive as well. And again,
Mhm,
like, hey, you want to demonstrate impact? Use an instructional designer to create an instructional designer with a background in education to create all of your training, pepper in assessments, give a pre-test, post-test, and then there's your data.
mhm,
Have people, are you able to demonstrate impact? But not only that, but obviously, like, you follow up with their managers. And this is another reason why it needs to It needs to go outside of the L&D department. We need to be working with managers. We need to be working with C-suite. It needs to be a whole orchestrated event. If you want to be able to measure performance, then following the training, I need to have protocols in place, working with the managers and the supervisors who are doing one-to-ones with these employees to determine if performance has improved or not. I mean, that's just one way. There's lots of ways, but yeah.
And I think a good thing that kind of brings this full circle is that intentionality and having an intentional system in place takes time. And that means it can't be reactive, because a reactive knee-jerk reaction is what you do in a panic mode. And when you're panicking, we'll not get into, our endocrine system and everything that happens there. But when you're panicking, you're not focusing on what's important, right? You're just reacting. And being intentional means being not reactive. And that means taking some time to figure out what's happening here. So
Yeah,
as we
absolutely.
close the circle, one last question for you, Dr. Christie. What belief are we replacing here in this discussion? We've used all of our evidence and our situations and shared knowledge. What beliefs are we trying to...
So what belief do we need to replace? We need to replace the belief that training is the default solution, because it isn't. It isn't the default solution. It is just one of several possible interventions that you can have to change behavior and change outcomes to get to a specific goal. And the real job for us in L&D is figuring out which one actually solves the problem. Yeah, so it's not always about training. If every solution to your problem requires training, then I think you can count on actually nothing improving. It's just one possible solution. You need experts who understand how to actually manage and change human behavior, who can come in, evaluate your organization from the top down, and tell you what various modalities of interventions you need to deploy to result in the change that you're looking for.
Yeah, I agree. And then you might lose the turtles, but we'll find a different use for them. Don't
I
worry.
think that's the goal. The goal is for you to look outside of your window and not see turtles all the way down. The goal is for you to look outside of your window and see a well-functioning organization that's making you money effectively, because that's what the business world is all
Business
about.
baby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kimmy. It's been a pleasure. All right. Well,
Bye.
we'll see you all next week. Okay, signing off now.